The message arrived at 03:41 a.m. EST on a secure channel designated for priority-level transmissions from deep cover assets, and it contained only 4 words. They found the wall. No context, no signature. Just a chilling fragment that triggered every alarm inside the operations center at CIA headquarters in Langley. Within 20 minutes, Assistant Deputy Director Charles W. Renner was awakened at his home in McLean, driven by a black Suburban through fog-draped Virginia roads, and ushered through 3 levels of biometric clearance before being handed a printed copy of the communication. The file was already flagged Crimson, a classification reserved for intelligence deemed vital to national security with direct implications for Soviet counterintelligence measures. Renner, a 30-year veteran of the agency with a face carved by decades of field work and nights without sleep, read the message 3 times before speaking. "Where was this routed from?" he asked. "Moscow," the watch officer replied, "via the Orchid Channel." That got his attention. Orchid was a long-standing, deeply embedded informant within Soviet municipal infrastructure, someone whose contributions had previously been limited to information about logistics, plumbing schematics, and the occasional overhead wire path. This was different. This was a seismic shift. The phrase itself, the wall, was familiar to a select handful of officers who had been briefed on cold signal, a dormant file hypothesizing the existence of embedded KGB operations hidden within Moscow's urban architecture, specifically involving concealed compartments used for illegal counter-surveillance operations. The idea had been floated in the late 70s, but was dismissed as too speculative, lacking credible confirmation. Now, suddenly, in the cold pre-dawn hours of March 14, 1982, the phrase returned like a ghost from a sealed file. By 04:15, a full-spectrum response protocol was activated. Linguistics teams began deconstructing the message for embedded ciphers. Field liaison units attempted to verify Orchid's status, and a red cell analyst was summoned to begin constructing possible interpretations. Renner called an emergency sitrep with the Soviet division chiefs, where theories unraveled quickly. If the wall was literal, it meant someone, either the Soviets or Orchid's parallel handlers, had uncovered the hidden room referenced in cold signal. If metaphorical, it might signal the breach of a protection mechanism or dead drop. Either way, Langley could no longer afford to treat the theory as a paranoid footnote. A secure telex was dispatched to the CIA station chief in Bonn requesting immediate coordination with West German intelligence, and another was sent to MI6. The director himself, awakened at 04:53, issued an unambiguous order: assume it's real. The map of Moscow was unrolled, satellite photographs of an unremarkable beige building on Malaya. Pirogovskaya Street were projected onto the Situation Room wall, and the first quiet murmur of a new operation was born: Whisper Room. As the sun crept over the horizon and Renner sipped lukewarm coffee in the half-lit war room, the implications unfurled before him like a coiled snake. If the KGB had indeed built black sites within civilian housing, and if the CIA had missed it for years, the rules of the Cold War had just been rewritten. In February of 1981, with snow caking the Moscow sidewalks and dense, soot-dusted banks, and the chill biting through even the heaviest wool coats, a man known only to the CIA as Orchid began noticing something he couldn't explain. Subtle patterns emerging in the architecture he had long believed he knew better than anyone. Orchid, whose real name was locked behind a redacted case file buried deep in Langley's Directorate of Operations, was a Soviet-trained civil engineer tasked with routine inspections and maintenance oversight of public housing blocks, particularly those used by low-ranking members of the diplomatic services and their families. On paper, it was an innocuous position. In practice, it granted Orchid limited but highly valuable access to a spectrum of Moscow's under-maintained infrastructure, a rare point of entry into Soviet civil space that made him an unusually well-placed observer for the CIA's eyes and ears in the East. It began with a requisition slip, a request filed internally for structural reinforcements on a unit located in the Kamovniki district, apartment 4B, at 17 Malaya Pirogovskaya Street. The request was routine in format, but suspicious in content. The apartment had been marked unoccupied for over 4 years. ostensibly due to asbestos removal protocols that had never been completed. And yet, the request included specifications for reinforced masonry, acoustic insulation, and wiring rerouted in a way that made no functional sense for a dwelling that was meant to be empty. Orchid took notice and began his own quiet inquiry, masking his interest as a bureaucratic follow-up. On a scheduled inspection run weeks later, he intentionally arrived early and loitered in the courtyard beneath the brutalist concrete facade of the building, noting the lights flickering on in 4B just before 6 p.m. Odd, given no residents were assigned there, and the rest of the building remained dim. On 3 separate occasions, he recorded activity: a figure entering with no keys, the sound of what could only be power tools operating well past curfew hours, and the distinct odor of industrial adhesive seeping out through a window frame, as if the apartment were being altered behind closed doors. He attempted to question the building superintendent, but the man was evasive, insisting the unit was sealed and uninhabited. When Orchid inquired about the work order, the super shrugged and said it must have been a clerical error. But Orchid knew the layout of these buildings, knew the way walls carried sound, how heat shifted in response to human presence, how a water meter shouldn't run when no one lived inside. He noticed small, telling details: a new lock on the trash chute door beneath 4B, the absence of dust on the hallway floor outside the apartment, the faint hum of electricity behind a wall that should have been disconnected from the grid. It was enough to rattle him, enough to move past curiosity and into concern. And on March 3, 1981, using a pre-established drop point under the excuse of delivering updated pressure blueprints, Orchid included a note on page 6 of the copied plans that simply read, Unit 4B, wired, reinforced, occupied without trace. Possible false wall. The message would not be decrypted and escalated until nearly a year later, but in that moment, Orchid had unknowingly uncovered the first breadcrumb in a trail that would eventually lead the CIA to something far more dangerous than a squatter's hideout. It would expose an invisible battlefield hidden inside Soviet brickwork. From the outside, 17 Malaya Pirogovskaya Street looked like any other concrete slab housing structure built during the post-war Soviet urban boom, gray, boxy, and uniform, a monolith of state efficiency nestled in the quiet, residential lanes of the Komovniki district. Children played between rusted swing sets in the courtyard. Elderly pensioners, bundled in the thick coats, shuffled along cracked walkways, and young diplomatic staff passed through the front doors, with briefcases in hand and blank expressions that revealed nothing. But beneath the dull routine of Soviet life, Orchid's observations had triggered a growing alarm inside Langley. The late-night visitors, always different men, never together, arriving between the hours of 1 and 4 a.m., were only one part of the pattern. Orchid had mapped their comings and goings in discrete notations concealed within his engineering reports, marking exact arrival times, describing their coats, shoes, facial hair, even the gait of their walk, anything to identify a consistency in behavior or appearance. Then came the power data. Orchid noted that the electrical meters for apartment 4B registered consumption far exceeding the baseline for an unoccupied unit, spikes that suggested industrial-grade equipment or high-powered lighting, especially concentrated between dusk and dawn. Langley's analysts picked up the thread in the spring of 1981, running historical utility records through pattern detection software, still in its early stages but effective enough to flag anomalies. They compared meter readings against comparable buildings in the area and found something startling. Power consumption in 4B rivaled that of a local administrative annex 5 blocks away. Yet there was no listed tenant, no government registration, no maintenance logs beyond the doctored request Orchid had identified. The next escalation came from satellite photography, taken during a rare cloudless stretch in early April. The CIA's KH-9 hexagon satellite managed a clean pass over Moscow, and while the 30-inch resolution was limited, analysts could detect subtle inconsistencies in the rooftop heat signature of 17 Malaya Pirogovskaya. One section of the building, directly above 4B, radiated residual thermal energy long after the rest of the roof had cooled for the night, suggesting a vertical heat stack consistent with concealed equipment or reinforced compartments. That matched Orchid's in-person observations, specifically the reports of humming noises, faint vibration through the floor, and soundproofing that seemed to muffle the unit entirely from the rest of the floor. The CIA ran the findings through the Cold Signal Archive, a dormant file containing outdated Soviet safehouse models and rumors from long-retired assets, and found eerie parallels to a known KGB technique first seen in East Berlin during the late 1960s. Compartmentalized safehouses disguised as residential units, with false walls, soundproof insulation, and dedicated power lines routed through mislabeled junction boxes. These units were used to conduct operations that required maximum discretion. Document photography, psychological interrogations, radio signal interceptions, even covert blackmail setups. The resemblance was uncanny. This wasn't misuse of state housing. It was deliberate, methodical construction of an operational nest buried inside a diplomatic residential shell. The team at Langley gave it a new internal tag: Mirror Box. Surveillance assets were redirected, and requests were made for Orchid to obtain floor plans, load-bearing details, and anything that could verify structural manipulation. What the CIA had on its hands was no longer speculative. It was the beginning of confirmation that the KGB had turned residential Moscow into a hive of shadows, and Mirror Box might just be the first doorway cracked open. He had come across the phrase once, almost as an afterthought, during a debriefing in Frankfurt, delivered in a tired whisper by a man who had given up everything but his paranoia. The defector, codenamed Polaris, was a former senior operations officer in the KGB's Second Chief Directorate, the division tasked with internal counterintelligence and surveillance. His knowledge of active Soviet methodology was already years out of date by the time he slipped across the border in 1977. But the CIA had still mined him relentlessly for scraps, details about safehouse protocol, telephone intercept habits, even how Moscow Center handled internal leaks. But buried in the hundreds of hours of transcripted interviews, one bizarre anecdote had stood out, only to be shelved and forgotten until Orchid's report pulled it back into focus. Polaris had spoken vaguely of a legend among directorate officers, a mythical series of rooms hidden inside apartments, behind apartments, built into the bones of Soviet architecture like tumors no one could cut out. He called them rooms within rooms, places used only in the event of emergencies when standard channels were compromised. They were not staging areas or regular safe houses. They were fallback chambers for deep state operations, blackmail, psychological control, covert storage, and in some cases, detainment. When asked if he could verify their existence, Polaris only shrugged and said, "Ask the Archive of Mirrors." At the time, the phrase had seemed like metaphor, the poetic paranoia of a man unmoored from his world, and the CIA's analysts had marked it as low-priority noise in a sea of more urgent intelligence. But now, staring at the data from Orchid, the reinforced walls, the unusual wiring, the hidden space within apartment 4B, those words carried weight they hadn't before. The CIA's internal database search for Archive of Mirrors yielded a dead end. No physical archive, no codename match, just a few scattered notes suggesting a rumored KGB initiative from the mid-60s involving psychological containment operations. Again, more ghost stories than hard intelligence. But what if it wasn't metaphor? What if this archive referred not to documents, but to a physical network, locations embedded throughout Moscow's diplomatic housing grid, designed to serve as untraceable, non-standard nodes in the Soviet surveillance state? Langley's Soviet division reopened Polaris's file and began reanalyzing his statements under a new lens. They tracked obscure budget reports, city renovation grants, and a cluster of KGB-owned properties that all shared similar architectural anomalies. The theory began to crystallize. The Archive of Mirrors wasn't a library. It was a map, a distributed network of concealed chambers, each acting as a mirror reflecting operations, secrets, and ghosts of the KGB's most sensitive work. And 4B at Malaya Pirogovskaya wasn't an outlier. It was the first confirmed shard of a long-suspected but never-proven system. For the first time in a decade, the CIA began to believe that the urban myths circulating through their most seasoned analysts weren't myths at all. They were blueprints. And if Mirrorbox was real, then so too was everything Polaris had feared. The CIA had no illusions about the risks of operating inside the heart of Moscow, where even the shadows had ears, and every doorway might be watched by an informant, a neighbor, or worse, a directorate agent. To confirm the existence of a concealed chamber inside apartment 4B without triggering alarms at the Lubyanka required surgical precision and a plan that couldn't be traced to Langley, the embassy, or any known asset. Enter Julian Reed, a second-tier American embassy administrative attaché whose job consisted mostly of pushing paper and coordinating diplomatic shipments, but whose affable manner and impressive Russian had earned him a strange kind of trust among certain local workers, especially a middle-aged municipal building inspector named Mikhail Petrovich Sorokin. Sorokin was lonely, overworked, and quietly disillusioned with the inefficiencies of the Soviet system, and Reed had spent 6 months cultivating a casual friendship over cigarettes and shared complaints about broken plumbing and endless signatures for nothing. The opportunity came when Orchid, acting on Reed's suggestion, filed an innocuous maintenance complaint from a forged tenant alias citing chronic heating inconsistencies in 4B, a complaint designed to mirror seasonal building issues already logged in other units. The maintenance office, understaffed and in perpetual backlog, bumped the issue to the city inspector's desk due to its proximity to previously repaired steam lines. Sorokin received the order on a damp morning in September 1981, and Reed, having run into him by coincidence, suggested they grab lunch after the job, just two old colleagues crossing paths. With barely a nod to the front desk, Sorokin accessed the unit with a master key, accompanied by a junior maintenance tech, and stepped into a space that, on first inspection, was oddly sterile. The windows were sealed tight, curtains drawn, and though there were no furnishings, the floor bore faint scuff marks, as if heavy equipment had recently been moved. No bed, no sink, no table, just emptiness and silence. But Sorokin, ever the veteran inspector, noticed something else. On the far wall, near the back of the room, the brick pattern broke rhythm. There, behind where a bookcase might ordinarily sit, was a vertical seam, barely visible, maybe half an inch wide, running from floor to ceiling. It was too precise to be a crack and too thin for a pipe chase. Sorokin squinted, tapped the bricks. The echo was wrong, hollow, too hollow. Reed, who had slipped him a disposable camera weeks earlier under the pretense of documenting bureaucratic decay for the embassy's newsletter, made a casual comment about the peculiar symmetry of Soviet construction, prompting Sorokin to snap a photo. For the Americans, he joked. He took only one, careful to make it seem playful rather than deliberate, then pocketed the camera. The visit concluded without incident. The inspection log was stamped. The maintenance tech wrote up a report recommending pipe insulation, and the file was buried under dozens of other requests. But 3 days later, when the film was developed inside the embassy's darkroom by a CIA field photographer, the photo emerged, grainy and dim, but unmistakable. The seam was there, a vertical incision in an otherwise unbroken wall, a line in the brickwork like a zipper waiting to be opened, and with it, the first undeniable proof that something in 4B had been built not to be seen, but to be sealed. On the cold afternoon of November the 17th, 1981, a second, more dangerous maneuver was executed, a covert return to apartment 4B, this time through a utility crawlspace Orchid had quietly mapped weeks earlier, while pretending to assess a water pressure imbalance on the floor below. With a smuggled miniature borescope camera threaded through a vent aperture and guided into the space behind the seam, photographed by Sorokin, the CIA's field asset captured what could only be described as impossible, a hidden chamber that did not exist on any blueprint, inspection report, or municipal file. The images, grainy, dim, but real, were unlike anything Langley had seen. Behind the false brickwork was a concealed steel frame door with a locking mechanism that looked distinctly non-residential, its handle recessed, no knob, flush like something off a submarine hatch. It opened inward into a narrow corridor just wide enough for a single person to walk through sideways, its walls and floor sealed in industrial-grade polymer coating, the kind used in sterile labs. At the end of the corridor, the camera revealed a room approximately 6 feet by 8 feet, dimly lit by a flickering fluorescent bulb that bounced light off stainless steel shelving lining every wall from floor to ceiling. Each shelf was filled with small metal boxes, uniform in size and painted dull gray, most bearing 3-digit alphanumeric codes like L37, H14, and VX3. On closer inspection, several were identified as microfilm canisters, while others appeared to contain sealed vials filled with transparent or slightly amber liquids, some labeled, some not. A workbench took up the right side of the chamber, and on it sat an array of photographic equipment: film loaders, red light lamps, magnifiers, a tray of developer fluid, and a small tank for processing negatives. Nearby was a device unmistakable to the trained eye, a shortwave transmitter with Soviet military serial markings, half concealed beneath a cloth draped with dust, as if hastily covered during an interrupted session. But the detail that chilled the analysts in Langley most wasn't the transmitter, the microfilm, or the developer trays. It was the drain, set into the center of the room's tiled floor, circular, rust-lined, with a ring of faint reddish discoloration surrounding it. And directly above it, bolted into the ceiling, was a mount for what appeared to be surgical-grade lighting, the kind used in clinics or interrogation rooms. The implications were horrifying. This wasn't merely an archive or a transmission node. It was a space engineered for containment, processing, and potentially physical coercion. The room's scale suggested it wasn't used often, perhaps only in emergencies or when external sites were compromised. But its presence within a diplomatic housing block in the heart of Moscow confirmed beyond doubt what the CIA had only dared theorize: that the KGB operated clandestine, microsites embedded inside civilian structures, capable of processing classified data, manipulating targets, and disappearing people, all without leaving a trace. The photographs were smuggled out over 3 weeks in pieces, each image couriered through embassy pouch protocols and reassembled in Langley like fragments of a dark mosaic. When the final frame was developed, showing the drain in stark monochrome beneath the glare of a surgical lamp, Deputy Director Renner reportedly whispered, "This isn't intelligence work anymore. This is something else." From that moment forward, Operation Mirrorbox shifted classification levels. The hidden room had been found, and it changed everything. They called it Operation Echoes, not because of sound, but because of reflection. A mission to map the reverberations of a hidden space whose purpose no longer remained silent. Within days of confirming the existence of the secret chamber in apartment 4B, Langley authorized a parallel investigation to dissect not just the structure, but its function, assembling a task force of cryptographers, photographic analysis experts, chemical engineers, and Cold War-era psychological operations, specialists to reconstruct the story behind the walls. The borescope footage had already confirmed the room's skeletal features: steel shelving, microfilm canisters, vials, darkroom equipment, and a shortwave transmitter. But what Operation Echoes uncovered as they began cross-referencing internal Soviet leak archives, declassified West German counterintelligence reports, and a trove of confiscated East Bloc surveillance tapes painted a much darker picture. In over a dozen documented cases between 1976 and 1980, Western diplomats stationed in Moscow had been quietly recalled under sudden, unexplained circumstances. Nervous breakdowns, allegations of infidelity, missing briefcases, suicide attempts. The psychological patterns emerged as Echoes analysts trawled through CIA incident files. Unsourced blackmail materials had circulated internally, always vague, always unverified, but enough to shatter careers and strain alliances. A Canadian attaché in 1977 had abruptly resigned after being shown photos of himself in what he swore were manufactured situations. A French liaison officer had returned home to find his wife had received audio recordings of him discussing nuclear posture with a Russian escort, except he insisted he'd never had the conversation. Operation Echoes posited a chilling hypothesis. 4B was one node in a Soviet blackmail grid. Its walls weren't just silent, they were capturing everything. The photographic equipment was standard Soviet surveillance grade, but combined with the chemicals in the vials, likely ammonium thiosulfate and methyl ethyl ketone, common in rapid-developed photo labs, it indicated an on-site darkroom. Photographs weren't sent elsewhere. They were developed and edited in-house within hours of capture. And the shortwave transmitter, its range, power configuration, and antenna output suggested it had been built for burst transmissions. fast, encrypted data dumps back to the Lubyanka, possibly to the KGB's infamous Fifth Directorate. These weren't casual eavesdropping operations. They were precision-engineered setups designed to capture and weaponize vulnerability. Visuals, voices, habits, anything exploitable. What Operation Echoes found most compelling was a faint serial code etched into the back of one of the microfilm canisters recovered from Orchid's smuggled samples. AM-17 Ju-1, Archive of Mirrors, Room 17, Item 21. The naming convention wasn't random. The CIA now believed that 4B was the 17th active compartment in a distributed network, each codified, each collecting, a hidden echo chamber reflecting the worst fears of every diplomat who stepped too far out of line, and capable of manufacturing ruin without ever pulling a trigger. The room had not been built merely to observe. It had been built to distort, amplify, and deliver psychological payloads with surgical accuracy. Operation Echoes had its mandate. Follow the signals, track the pattern, identify other nodes in the grid. Because if one room existed in Komotniki, others surely pulsed in the shadows of Warsaw, East Berlin, Prague, each one listening, watching, waiting. The reel arrived wrapped in the lining of a thermos bottle, hidden beneath layers of industrial grease and capped with a false bottom sealed in wax. An old-school method Orchid had improvised, mimicking Soviet food delivery containers used by factory workers. Extracted during one of his final clandestine visits to Apartment 4B, the reel was passed along a relay chain spanning 3 handlers, 4 forged identities, and over 1,200 miles before reaching West Berlin's CIA station. Nestled inside a drab office 2 floors above a laundromat near Kurfürstendamm. There, under the cautious supervision of case officer Margaret Hill and photo analysis technician Hans Kruger, the microfilm was carefully developed in a light-controlled chamber using East German-sourced chemicals to avoid any hint of tampering by Western agents. What emerged on that reel would trigger an immediate Tier 1 classification and rewrite the operational tempo of the entire mirror box investigation. Frame by frame, the grainy images revealed not static blueprints or intercepted telegrams, but a gallery of Western diplomatic personnel, captured not in formal settings, but in moments so intimate, so compromising, that their very existence confirmed a depth of surveillance previously unimagined. A British cultural attaché in Moscow, photographed embracing a translator in what appeared to be the coat room of a Soviet museum, a senior U.S. trade liaison in Rome, visibly intoxicated, gesturing emphatically at a woman in a hotel suite, later identified as a suspected Russian asset. In another frame, dated and time-stamped with Cyrillic characters, a West German ambassador in Paris could be seen removing confidential folders from his briefcase during a dinner with a family friend. A man the CIA knew had ties to the Stasi. The photographs were methodically organized, each with a reference number etched along the border, L3907, F1202, V7814, corresponding to what Operation Echoes analysts now recognized as identifiers from the Archive of Mirrors system. These were not random catches of opportunistic surveillance. They were chapters in a long-running program of targeted documentation, built to exert pressure, apply leverage, or neutralize dissent within the diplomatic ranks of NATO-aligned nations. Worse still, several of the individuals captured in these frames had either been quietly reassigned over the past 5 years or subjected to abrupt internal investigations after anonymous allegations surfaced. Allegations now understood to have likely been triggered by intelligence passed along from 4B and its sister sites. The reel was more than evidence. It was an indictment, a dossier of rot deliberately cultivated through the slow drip of watched weaknesses. The fact that these images extended beyond Moscow confirmed what the CIA feared most. Mirrorbox was global, not merely a city-spanning network of secret rooms, but an international program, one that had eyes in Western. Embassies across the continent using custom-built compartments hidden in plain sight to turn the private lives of diplomats into weapons of statecraft. For Director Renner and the Mirrorbox Task Force, the implications were immediate and existential. If the Soviets could access private conversations at this level and hold them in reserve until the moment of maximum impact, then loyalty itself was now a liability. No one was safe, not in embassies, not in apartments, not even in memory. And the film in Berlin was only one reel among what had to be hundreds, maybe thousands. The archive of mirrors wasn't just real, it was alive, and it had been watching the West for years. The trap didn't snap with the sound of steel on flesh or the chaos of sirens. It snapped with silence, vanishing so clean it left no debris behind. Orchid, the CIA's linchpin asset embedded in Moscow's civil engineering corps and the unwitting discoverer of the hidden room, simply failed to make his scheduled drop on December 3, 1981. A missed drop wasn't uncommon. Weather, surveillance pressure, logistical misfires, these happened. But when his secondary signal, a discrete mark on a maintenance junction box near Taganka Square, also failed to appear within 48 hours, alarms began to ring. Langley held its breath, hoping against instinct. Then, on the morning of December 5th, another disappearance. A junior embassy translator with no known ties to Mirrorbox vanished en route to the metro. She had been on the CIA's indirect contact web, flagged only for her occasional presence during pouch handoffs. Her absence confirmed what the agency feared. Moscow Center had realized something was wrong. That same day, a message came through diplomatic backchannels via the Soviet Foreign Ministry. Veiled in bureaucratic language but unmistakably hostile, it closed with a single line that froze every operative who read it. "This will be remembered." The phrase, while seemingly innocuous, was a known KGB death knell, previously documented in internal files linked to two compromised networks during the Hungarian uprising and the early Prague operations. The implication wasn't just retribution, it was a promise of patience. Back in Langley, the Mirrorbox Task Force convened an emergency intelligence fusion session. Operation Echoes fed its latest findings into the analysis core, and what emerged shattered any remaining illusions of containment. The room in 4B was no isolated enigma. It was a perfect manifestation of the blueprints long speculated to be part of a Soviet psychological warfare doctrine, the Archive of Mirrors. The CIA's mapping of KGB real estate proxies, electrical anomalies in diplomatic housing, and satellite-captured thermal deviations now painted a terrifying mosaic. The Soviets had embedded operational cells, sealed chambers, and memory-forging platforms across Europe, each concealed in mundane spaces, each designed to spy, capture, distort, and blackmail. The revelations reframed a decade of quiet diplomatic failures, resignations, and inexplicable behavioral shifts in key foreign officers. Langley realized it had been fighting a war without knowing the battlefield had shifted indoors, into walls and wires, into plumbing shafts and false brick seams. With Orchid gone, and the archive confirmed, the priority shifted. Containment was no longer possible. Identification became the goal. The CIA authorized deep retrospective audits of embassy security footage, reanalysis of past psychological breakdowns among staff, and black bag operations targeting suspected Soviet-occupied buildings in Berlin and Vienna. Meanwhile, internal memos circulated among senior leadership, stamped in crimson ink. The Archive of Mirrors is not a relic. It is an ongoing operation. Assume exposure, assume manipulation. No diplomat, no agent, no memory can be considered untampered. And in the mirror-flat calm of that December week, intelligence officers across Europe began to see their own reflections, not as hunters, but as prey who had never known they were being watched through the walls. What lay behind the false wall of apartment 4B was never merely a room. It was doctrine, engineered into plaster and steel, the architectural embodiment of a psychological war waged not with bullets, but with silence, pressure, and curated shame. In its dimensions, 6 by 8 feet, no wider than a closet, was encoded a strategy far more enduring than any missile silo or radar sweep. Control not through force, but through the manipulation of truth, perception, and memory. The CIA, after months of decryption, reconstruction, and post-mortem analysis, came to understand the room not as a passive storage site for blackmail material, but as a dynamic factory for influence, a micro-theater of coercion built to turn human vulnerability into political leverage. The photographs weren't just evidence. They were tools, snapped with precision, selected for psychological impact, filed not alphabetically, but by anticipated pressure points: sexual, ideological, familial, financial. The chemicals were not just developer fluid, they were catalysts of carefully timed revelations. The transmitter didn't merely relay information, it initiated manipulation, syncing exposure to diplomatic cycles, summits, or negotiations. The room was small, yes, but its echoes were vast. From the resignation of a British ambassador in Bonn to the sudden psychiatric leave of a U.S. defense attaché in Rome, the fingerprints of 4B, and rooms like it, had already shaped policies, skewed alliances, and eroded trust across continents. And though Orchid was gone, the data he left behind formed a blueprint of intent. This was not ad hoc espionage. It was systemic, a latticework of artificial narratives designed to erode the West from within, by making its operatives question their own reality. At Langley, Director Renner stood before a room of analysts, each one holding a folder marked Mirror Box, and said what no one had dared put into writing. They don't need to defeat us. They only need us to doubt ourselves. That was the message hidden in the wall, not a threat, a fact. The Cold War's battleground had never been frozen on a map. It had always been porous, psychological, and unannounced. The Soviets had realized something the West hadn't, that a single image, revealed at the right moment, could do more damage than a dozen stolen cables, that a whisper caught on tape in a sealed room could do what propaganda could not: undermine faith, provoke silence, destroy trust. The room was a weapon built from absence: no window, no light, no human record except the shadows on film. And it was a message, loud in its quietness: we are inside your walls. And so, the final report, submitted in January 1982 to the CIA's Deputy Directorate for Operations, didn't end with conclusions. It ended with a warning. The archive of mirrors is not closed. It is evolving. And while the West builds better satellites, they are building better walls. Not all walls keep people out. Some keep truths in, and some, when finally opened, show us not what our enemies did, but what they always knew we'd be too proud to see. If you found this story chilling, enlightening, or thought-provoking, don't stop here. Subscribe for more Cold War secrets, spycraft revelations, and untold intelligence operations that shaped history from the shadows. What's behind the next wall? Hit like, share with fellow history sleuths, and follow for the next declassified chapter.